Hi, everybody. Broadcasting from my home office again, but dressing up a little bit to bring some Shabbos energy through the video screen. This is a Dvar Torah about Parshat VaYigash entitled Rootless, Cosmopolitans. The Joseph novella is a powerful story of internecine familial conflict, of brothers first driven apart by ego and envy, then reunited in a miraculous reconciliation. After a whole parshah's worth of self-concealment last week, Joseph has now witnessed the growth and care of his brothers and can continue his charade no longer. In a powerful scene, he divests himself of his disguise and discloses his true identity to his long-lost siblings. In perhaps the most moving scene of this week's Torah portion, perhaps in a moment he feared would never come, our ancestor Jacob is brought back together with his long-lost boy. They weep. We weep. The curtains fall. Fin. But that's not the actual end of the parsha. It's the climax, sure. But there is over a whole chapter of minute logistical detail regarding the resettlement of the Hebrews in Egypt, implications of a fundamental cultural conflict. Our ancestors, you see, were shepherds, and Egyptians either worshipped animals or at least didn't eat them, depending on your commentator. See Genesis 46:34. And also, not a big deal at all, a massive restructuring of Egyptian society. After the satisfying and soothing rapprochement between Joseph and his family, seeds of conflict seem to have been sown once more, perhaps to be reaped in the coming subjugation of the Hebrews. Why couldn't the Torah leave us with our happy ending? Didn't we earn it? The concluding sections of Parshat VaYigash read like an entirely new narrative. So what was the Torah trying to teach us in including these sections after the story seems to have wrapped up? Whether describing Joseph's further reorganizing of Egyptian society in response to the famine, or bringing us back to his original far-reaching restructuring of the economy, Chapter 47 of our Parsha details some radical choices he made. Joseph begins by consolidating the nation's finances, centralizing all available money in the royal bank. And as the famine progresses, the people approach the central food store for their rations, and Joseph begins by trading sustenance for their livestock. And then he moves to collectivize the land. Finally, the people have become tenant farmers on lands they once owned, taxed 20% of the yield to the palace. Some have read these far-reaching reforms as setting the conditions for the Hebrews' future enslavement, as Pharaoh becomes the sole employer in the nation. However, we would be kidding ourselves, I think, to believe that the Egyptian economy was not already based on coerced labor. Rather, Joseph seems to have brought the native Egyptians to the level that they treat their foreign residents. An example of the Egyptians now being subject to further influence can be found in Joseph's surprising, perhaps offensive, mass population transfers, moving city-dwelling Egyptians from one metropolis to another. As the Torah says, and he moved the population city by city from one extent of Egypt's border to another. Genesis 47:21. Jews reading this pasuk with contemporary eyes, after our own experiences being subject to expulsion and deportation, could very easily read this with suspicion or even hurt. The Bechor Shor, French medieval commentator, wrote that this stratagem was intended to subjugate Pharaoh's subjects entirely to the throne, so they could no longer point to their ancestral holdings and make claims of independence. Later in our Torah, the Holy One may offer some subtle resistance to such a policy in assigning allotments of land within Canaan to the tribes, which will always, in perpetuity, revert back to their possession at the advent of the Yovel, the Jubilee. The Torah, it seems, doesn't want us fully dependent. That's not how it envisions the ideal society, but it rather guarantees our availing of ourselves of the resources that we need. However, we can look at Joseph's act from a different, more charitable vantage point. We cannot imagine that Joseph intended to create a society in which injustice would be furthered. He's Joseph Hatzadik, he's Joseph the Righteous. That would be the opposite of what he's about. Rashi offers an interventionary reason for Joseph's surprising logistical choice. He writes, Joseph caused them to pass from city to city, to remind them that they have no fundamental portion in the land, moving them from one city to another. The Torah did not have to write this, except to show you an appreciation of Joseph's intention, hoping to prevent shame on his brothers and their descendants, so the Egyptians could not call them displaced persons, golim, like the root galut, exile. Rashi, drawing on a Gemara found on Chulin 60b, interpreted Joseph's transferring of populations as a kind of social engineering. Egyptian society was fundamentally based on an unjust binary, native-born or foreigner, and the Hebrews, having immigrated to Egypt as refugees seeking basic sustenance, were subject to Egypt's prejudice. That is to say, it wasn't Joseph's centralization of the economy that set the stage for our coming enslavement, but rather the bigotry at the heart of Egyptian society. So, Joseph dislodged the putatively native-born from their holdings in order to dislodge this prejudice from their hearts. Sadly, that effort might not have worked in the end. The Renaissance Italian commentator Ovadia Sforno agrees with Rashi that Joseph's effort to resettle the populations had social implications. But instead of trying to impact the Egyptians, Joseph was endeavoring to have them impact him. Sforno writes, he moved them to live with him, so they would say to him, go, acquire, and take care of the land, all before them, with the consent of cohabitants. So instead of a mass population transfer, Sforno interprets our verse as describing a targeted relocation of representatives from the entirety of the land to live in the capital city close to the seat of power. In centralizing the economy to ensure survival during a massive societal upheaval, who could ever imagine such an experience? Joseph exercised immense amounts of power, but Sforno saw this as insurance of accountability and transparency. Joseph did not expropriate the land and chattel to take possession of it, but rather to serve as a steward and caretaker, ensuring that these precious natural resources would be well taken care of and devoted to produce what they can for the betterment of all. In responding to a catastrophe, Joseph knew that big steps needed to be taken, that daring acts had to be done. One cannot respond to a calamity with half measures. With individual farms puttering along on their own, there was simply no way to ensure that all people living in Egypt, or the region, had the food they needed to survive the oncoming famine. Joseph was blessed with dream vision, which provided him with advance awareness of the coming catastrophe, and he coupled that foreknowledge with Egypt's fertile riverbed and vast agricultural holdings, transforming it into a massive agrarian engine of Egypt, capable of producing enough subsistence for all. However, to accomplish this, Joseph needed to change the world. He instituted population transfers to dislodge people from their ancestral holdings, intended to also move them away from their incipient nativism. Beyond his effort to counter Egyptian prejudice against his refugee relatives, one can perhaps also see an effort to show people that their well-being is bound up in each other. Moving them away from their particular land equalized the people, seeing their fates as interconnected. The 20% tax instituted could be read as a penalty, or as an effort to make sure that there would always be a centralized resource bank in case famine or drought or another cataclysm came. Finally, according to Sforno, Joseph made sure that in exercising this great power, he would not become a pharaoh himself, but would remain a servant. While Joseph's personal narrative was one of redemption and success, he could only achieve these positions through being cast down into the deepest pit. Yes, he gained influence, but always as second in command, emphasizing that the power is not his to possess, but rather to use, to deploy, to bestow. And he had people now all around him, his siblings, his father, and now his fellow cohabitants, to reflect back to him the person he must be to ensure the well-being of all. Shabbat Shalom.